Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Okay, so let me begin. So as a society, we face lots of different policy questions, right? So what should we do about international trade? What type of trade agreements should we sign? How proactive should we be against climate change? And so we face lots of different questions, and what I'd like to do today is to tell you a little bit about my research and how I think that my work can contribute to our collective deliberations. Okay, so let's take as an example the question of what should be the minimal wage. So this is a policy question, and it's a relatively simple policy question, but still one that has lots of different aspects, right? And first, we should sort of acknowledge that there's different non-economic aspects to this policy question, right? So for example, we might worry that a minimum wage that's too low is maybe exploitative in some way, right? So maybe it's something to do with the power relations it creates or a certain relationship that we just don't want in our society. We might also worry that a 20 franc minimum wage is too high because it interferes with individual freedom, right? So if two people want to sign a labor contract, who is the government to interfere in this decision, right? So there are these types of considerations, which I think are important and deserve space. However, there are also the economic aspects of the question, right? So when we think about a minimum wage, we might also wonder about what the economic implications of this policy would be. And this is something that economists can tell us a lot about, right? So a lot of my colleagues, and in a previous life, maybe me as well, can build, pretty reliable models of the labor market and tell us something about what are the likely implications of different policies in terms of the income distribution and the prices. Okay, so here I'm going to call an economic consequence a combination of an income distribution and a price. And so we know from economic models that the minimal wage question looks something like this. Okay, so these are kind of made-up numbers. But we know that it looks something like this, which is that if we set a low minimum wage, the price of services will be relatively low, right? Because you can hire people to do things cheaply. But the income distribution will be very dispersed, so we'll have a lot of income inequality. On the other hand, if we set a higher minimum wage, the prices of services is going to be higher, but we'll have less income inequality, right? Okay. And so this is what the type of analysis that economics can produce, but we're sort of still not done, right? So there's this next question, which is what is it that we should be doing with this information, right? So how should we evaluate which one of these economic consequences is better, right? And this is kind of a fundamental question of how much should we worry about income inequality relative to, for example, the price of services. Now, some of you may sort of look at this question and say, well, this is, at this point, a matter of personal opinion or personal beliefs, or maybe something to do with kind of individual values or kind of how much you care or think that inequality is important. However, what I do in my work is I explore this possibility that maybe we can make some progress on this question starting from shared ethical principles. Okay, so maybe it's not so much a matter of individual opinion or individual preferences, but rather something that we can reason about or even agree about if we explore the full implications of our shared ethical beliefs. And so let me illustrate a little bit how this type of construction works. So let's think of this screen as representing all possible rankings of economic consequences. Okay, so remember here an economic consequence is an income distribution and a price. And by all possible rankings, I just mean sort of different ways of arranging these things in a line, okay, from 1 to infinity, I guess. And so there are many different ways of ranking things. And our task is to try and find the right ranking in the sense that we want to find the ranking that corresponds to the ethical ranking of these things, to sort of statements that we can use for making statements like this combination of income distribution and prices is better than this other one. Okay, and so this seems like a very difficult problem, right? So we have infinitely many ways of ranking stuff, very different views on what the ranking should look like at the end. But as it turns out, we can go quite far with kind of trying to narrow down the sets of rankings that we're looking at by restricting to sort of these very benign, widely agreed upon ethical principles. Okay, so let's start with one. So here I'm going to draw things that are a bit like Venn diagrams. So you should have the Venn diagram framework in mind. Okay, so let's start with one condition, which is what we call the Pareto condition or the unanimity condition. And here it's the basic idea, which is an ethical stance, that making everyone better off can't be a bad thing. Okay, so this is kind of a very minimal requirement. It sort of basically says that a situation where everyone has 100 francs is better than a situation where everyone has 50 francs, right? Because everyone's better off, so why not? And most economists would actually sort of use this as a starting point and kind of say, well, we're not sure what the correct ethical ranking is, but we know that it has to be some point over here, right? Because anything outside of this set is just crazy. There's just, why would we think that it's a good thing to make that it's not a good thing to make everybody better off? Okay, and so this is an ethical principle that's hopefully widely shared. The problem is that on its own, it doesn't tell us very much, right? So in particular, it only tells us how to rank things in situations in which there's no conflicts of interest between people, but it doesn't tell us what to do when, there's some people who prefer one policy and other people who prefer a different policy, right? So whenever there's sort of a real conflict or a situation that generates some winners and losers, the Pareto principle really doesn't have anything to tell us about that. However, we also know that the Pareto condition, because it's so broad, includes a lot of things that are just kind of non-starters because they don't treat people equally, right? So for example, one ranking that satisfies the Pareto ranking is the dictatorial ranking that says, let's always do what's best for Anne. Okay, so forget about everybody else, we just care about Anne. That is a ranking that satisfies Pareto. Okay, so it's sort of on its own not a very restrictive condition, and you can see how just using this, we can't get very far in terms of reasoning about inequality and how to set a minimum wage, for example. Okay. So in current work that's joined with Luis Mota Freitas, who's currently a PhD student, we propose adding an additional condition, which is a sort of equal treatment condition that says that everybody's income should matter equally. Okay, so a way to think about this is as the ethical stance that a situation in which Anne has 100 and Bob has 50 is just as good, so no better or no worse, than a situation where Bob has 100 and Anne has 50. Okay, so it's kind of saying, that in some sense, everybody's income should matter equally, and we shouldn't have a bias for Anne over Bob or the other way around. Now, in the context of a minimum wage, this also seems like a very weak requirement, and indeed it is, but as it turns out, the intersection of these two conditions is quite restrictive. Okay, so our main theoretical result in this paper is that there exists at most one ranking that satisfies these two conditions. Okay, so look at what we did here. We started with these sort of two very benign, almost tautological ethical stances, right? So they are ethical stances. I still need you to get on board with them. But what we've seen is that even though each one of them on their own doesn't tell us very much, once we combine them, we get actually very powerful conclusions. Okay, so we sort of are able to narrow down to one ranking what the ordering or the ethical ordering of economic consequences should be. Okay. Now, I should tell you, and this it says here at most one. It also means there's a possibility of zero. We find that actually zero is a more likely possibility than one. So it actually turns out that these two ethical principles, more often than not, turn out to be inconsistent with one another, which means that you can't find any ranking that satisfies both of these conditions. However, we can still sort of characterize what are the rankings that come close to satisfying both of them. Okay, so we can sort of think about, satisfying this equal treatment condition to the greatest extent possible without violating Pareto. And there's sort of different ways in which you can reach these compromises. However, what we find is that these ways empirically yield similar results. And an implication of the formula that we derive is that we get sort of, what seems to me at least, like very reasonable levels of inequality aversion. Okay, so remember the question that we sort of thought was crucial for this question of how to rank economic consequences, which was how much should we care about inequality. The ranking that we find cares somewhat about inequality. Okay, so an implication is, for example, that a situation in which two people both get 50 is just as good as a situation in which one person gets 25 and the other one gets 100. Okay, and so notice that this has some inequality aversion because in the unequal distribution, total income is 125. So it sort of means that we're willing to pay 25 to equalize the income distribution. Okay. All right. So let's go back to this list that we started with of lots of different policy questions. The one we focused on here was the minimum wage. And remember that sort of if we were to just think about the economic aspects of the question, fully acknowledging that there's also these non-economic aspects, what we see is that, starting from these basic ethical principles, which most of us would agree on, we can arrive at very strong implications for how we should rank income distributions that have different levels of inequality. Okay, but notice that this question doesn't only come up in the context of a minimum wage, it also comes up in these other contexts. Right? So remember that here the economic consequences that we were thinking about were different combinations of income distributions and prices. At the core of the trade question, we have a similar trade-off, right? So if we think about signing a trade agreement, that will also change prices and it would change the income distribution. The ranking that we derive tells us how you would judge, how you would rank these different economic consequences. And the same goes for the question of redistribution. Right, so redistribution, we don't typically think about prices so much, but it's again a question about how much we're willing to pay to reduce inequality. Okay, and so, you'll see here, and I really want to drive this home, that this is kind of amazing, right? So, we start with these two very uncontroversial statements, and from these uncontroversial statements, we already make tremendous progress on three very important policy questions, and possibly even more, right? And I want to emphasize that this is really kind of, we're not, coming to this with any of our own opinions or saying anything controversial. It's really just the power of mathematical reasoning, okay? So this ability to start from these commonly shared ethical stances and to obtain something that's a formula for ranking income distributions, this is not something immediate. So it's not something that I can now explain to you in a few words, sort of why this implies that. It's really several steps of mathematical reasoning and of sort of thinking about this problem, and then also some empirical estimation to figure out what the formula actually gives us. Okay. And so you see that we've made quite a lot of progress on this type of questions. However, we still have some open questions, right? So in particular in this, I also want to say something about why I think that the formula that we develop still leaves a lot more to do in terms of these other policy questions. And the reason is that neither of our axioms fits particularly well with these questions, right? and or at least it needs some modification. So for example, when we think about climate change, remember that the Pareto condition says that making everyone better off can't be a bad thing. There's a question, who is everybody, right? Is everybody just people alive today? Is everybody also future generations? Does it include animals that might be affected by climate change? Okay, so you see that here, the starting point of Pareto is much harder in a sense, because we need to sort of think about the scope of the people that we're considering. A similar problem comes up with immigration, right? So if we think about immigration policy, again, there's a question about who is everyone. Is everyone just the residents of Switzerland? Does everyone also include people who may or may not immigrate to Switzerland depending on our immigration policy? And so that's a harder question. And of course, when we talk about declining fertility, there the problem is in some sense the worst, right? Because how do we take into account the interests of people who may or may not be born depending on what policy we decide to pursue? Okay, so for these questions, Pareto at least needs some modification, or needs, some further thought. And, for very similar reasons, our equal treatment condition is also problematic, right? Or at least controversial. So, a lot of people will take the stance that, for example, when we think about immigration, we should treat the interest of potential immigrants the same way as we treat the interest of Swiss residents. And I don't necessarily oppose this stance, but I don't think it has the same kind of universal and uncontroversial appeal, which really gives power to the methodology, right? And, again, here the things are sort of worse when we think about fertility policy. You could take the stance that we should take the interests of unborn children to be as important as the interests of people who are alive today. But again, it's not the same type of uncontroversial thing that really sort of was sort of very natural in the context of a minimum wage. And so all this to say is that I think I have lots more to work on ahead, but I do think that, the case of the minimum wage, or the case of thinking about ranking income distributions, provides some proof of concept that, maybe starting from these very basic ethical principles, which maybe will be different in these other contexts, right? But that we can still sort of build on that and have these far-reaching implications that are surprising, right? And so I think that, maybe there's a way to, instead of just have both sides of the debate shout their opinions louder and louder and see sort of whose voice wins out, I think these are things that we can reason about, and I think that actually there's sort of a lot more to do in terms of just finding common ground through this approach. Okay. So this is kind of where I'm hoping to go next, is I'm hoping to try and understand how far we can go with these shared ethical principles. Okay, so in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to say thank you. So thank you to the University of Zurich, and especially to the economics department for hiring me. And thank you to the Excellence Foundation and the UBS Center for supporting my work. And of course, to my employer. So thank you to the country of Switzerland and the canton of Zurich. I feel so grateful for this opportunity, and I am your humble servant. But I really do appreciate being, part of this place that really values inquiry and at least tolerates moderation. So thank you for that. I want to thank my family, which was supposed to be here, but I guess they... Hey, there they are. Okay, so, good. So my daughter Neva and my daughter Ori and my husband Matt, you are a source of pride and joy and inspiration, and I'm incredibly grateful to be part of this family. And Matt, thank you so much for all your support and for everything you do for us. And finally, thank you to all of you for your personal role in making this transition a success. We've felt so welcome here and so happy to be here, and we really appreciate all of your efforts in making this happen and for making our start here such a success. Okay, thank you. Thank you.